and pluralism, and hopefully we can have conversations throughout the hour that we have together. So as Michelle and I had talked about this training here today, we are recognizing and addressing intersecting identities and experiences of different individuals in order to promote inclusivity. Complicated sentence, lots of words. I will be going over what all of this means. So as you can see, this is how I've introduced myself before. My name is Cat Shieh. 我的普通话的名字是谢婉莹。我以前你可以看在这里，以前我有教书on the high school level. And also, as you can see, I've also worked in politics, and I've also worked for Asian Americans Advancing Justice. So I have worked in the Asian American community, and I continue to really like doing teaching wherever I can, which is why I've really appreciated this opportunity. And also, I think it's important to say I am from the Bay Area. So, as Michelle tries to, really bring community and bring civic engagement in the South Bay Area, I myself am from Cupertino. 所以今天, as you can see, the first training that we ever did together, thank you, Leslie, the first training we ever did together is talking about systemic racism, right? It's not only about like how I experience racism, but how I experience racism like in a larger set of like the world that continues racism to like so many different people, almost to the point where it's automatic, right? So that's what we learned the first time that we met together. The second time that Nicole was able to help facilitate here, we talked a lot about privilege. And it seemed that a lot of people had lots of good reflections about how like they carry privilege, how they don't carry privilege, how that changes in different situations. And 今天, as you can see today, we'll be learning about intersectionality, and we'll also be learning about pluralism. So in order for us to learn about pluralism, as you can see here, I'm actually using the Asian American community as an example. So pluralism, as you can see on this screen, it says it's when people of different classes, races, religions, identities, they're together in a society, but they're still different. So even though they're one group, there's still differences within a group. Right? So no one is like an overgeneralization. No one's a monolith. No one's a single story. Oftentimes we use the term stereotype to talk about pluralism as well. And like I had mentioned, I'm going to use Asian Americans and the Asian American community as an example of how we're one big group, but we are very different within the group, and that is engaging in pluralism. So as you can see here, the actual term, according to America, I'm actually going to type it into the chat here, is the Asian American community is actually called AANHPI plus MENA, which is quite long. A lot of people, including many Asians and Asian Americans, do not know what this means. So I have displayed it here on the screen. As you can see, AANHPI plus MENA stands for Asian American, right? Like I identify as East Asian American, right? Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern, North African. It is a lot of people. It is, if you look at the whole globe, Asia is already the largest continent with the most people and the most languages. It's a very complex area, plus the fact that we're adding the Middle East and we're also adding North Africa. It's a large set of people. It's a very diverse set of people. And so, as you can see here, this is a lot of text, but this is all to say, in the United States, the way that we've organized and how we name Asian Americans, as you can see, lots of different groups, lots of different names. As I had mentioned, again, very complex, right? And as you can see, I'm here like based in Chicago, which is why I have Illinois percentages. But right, like in California, we're looking at anywhere between 9 to 11%. In places like the Bay Area, in Los Angeles, we're looking at higher numbers of Asian Americans. And if I'm not mistaken, the South Bay Area, when I was growing up, and even still today, is one of the most Asian counties and Asian locations in the United States. So given the fact that we know that, as you can see, Asian Americans encompass a lot of different groups and a lot of different people here in America, that also means that when we think the term Asian American, or when we think the term Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern, North African, this actually means that when we think about the Asian American community, hopefully, as you can see from this slide, we're actually shifting to think about like the entire Asian American community, not only people who look like me, East Asian American. So here's a question that I get a lot, and that is, why are Asian Americans not politically active? Why don't they like come together more often? Why don't they like be in community with other groups? Right, groups of people in the United States. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, it is 7:09, it is 7:10 on your end, and what I'm going to ask you to do is, if you can type into the chat, why do you think this is something people believe? Why do people believe that Asian Americans aren't that politically active? Why do you think that people think that Asian Americans don't like to like interact with other groups of people? And by the way, that may or may not be true. It's just a theory and a stereotype that people have. Can you put something in the chat? Like, let's try to figure this out. Why do you think people believe these things about Asian Americans? It's 7:10. I'll give you about 90 seconds to type something into the chat. Let's see what happens.
Hey, Kat, do you mind defining what you mean by being politically active? Like
Yes,
some
definitely.
examples.
Lots of voting, running for office, raising money, even like putting up the lawn signs during election season, things like that. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. I put here for myself, I definitely noticed that this is something that people believe, that we don't stay active in politics, that we don't get together with different groups, that people believe this regardless of whether or not there are very few Asians or a lot of Asians, is definitely something that I've noticed. I don't see anything in the chat, but does anybody want to get off mute and maybe share a particular theory that they might have about why this is the case? Okay, so one said is like, we're not politically active because we don't have political interests in like to begin with. Thank you for that, Leslie. Someone said they don't go out, so then they quite literally don't see people, right? I think you all are definitely coming from a place of like truth and experience. Michelle, I'm noticing you saying like they literally don't go out and then so they don't see other people. And you said you kind of agree with the statement. I can definitely say for a fact that there are definitely many different Asian communities in which like even getting like Chinese elders to pick up their mail is already like an issue, right? And so I definitely want to like bring that to light. And especially in a place where you are not familiar with the language, you don't have extensive family who can help you, maybe you're afraid of deportation, then yeah, I wouldn't go outside either. Right. And so even this idea of kind of sheltering in place really comes from like feeling like difference and feeling like the world is hard to access. You know, there might be some fear involved or overwhelm for sure. Leslie said that they don't have much political interests. Yeah, something that I always really like to share is that it makes sense that someone is not political if someone comes from a country in which you're not allowed to be political, right? So when I think about, you know, like dictators, or when I think about like communism in Vietnam and how people like quite literally fled a political situation to be here like in America, if they're fleeing a political situation, why would you want to stay political, right? Like you quite literally escaped politics to stay alive. And so oftentimes I say that, you know, Asian Americans may struggle to be political if they come from a country in which they were not able to do so. Right. I actually argue that this is the case for many people who may come from Venezuela, Honduras as well, El Salvador, maybe parts of Mexico, right, where it's dangerous to be political. Same thing with the Philippines, sometimes China, Hong Kong, Vietnam, right? People flee political situations, and so there's no incentive to be political. And then it looks like Nicole says Asian Americans don't know how to find common interests with other minorities. I'd actually push you on this, Nicole. Is there a group that's good at finding common interests with other people? Or maybe not, and that's fine too.
I don't, yeah, I can't think of one right now.
Yeah, and so I think so that's where I push you, right? Whereas like, yeah, maybe it's true that Asian Americans don't quite know how to find common interests. I would actually argue that we make it hard in America for anyone to find common interests, right? Not just between different minorities, but just like knowing who also likes volleyball, knowing who also like wants to send their kid to China. Like it's hard to make community in America, especially if you have to drive everywhere or people are far apart, things like that. If it's hard to build community and commonality, then it becomes like also difficult when it comes to race and different languages and things like that, for sure. Someone said a lot of Asian Americans come from like less economically proficient countries and regions, causing trouble or distraction. Right. This is exactly what I'm talking about, right? Like getting political is a part of like what like makes quote unquote trouble in either a home country and or the US, right? And so I appreciate you also bringing that perspective to light. So with that being said, you start to realize like the kinds of reasons that we're listing here on this chat, it's not really like Asian Americans' fault, right? We start to realize in what ways Asian Americans are just a larger piece of like political conflict and being economically disadvantaged, or like other countries taking advantage of places in Asia, like the United States taking advantage of certain countries in Asia, right? Like that's definitely something that happens, right? And so hopefully this really brings us to light what work needs to happen within Asian Americans, but also understand it's not like totally our fault. So with that being said, as I had mentioned, really talking about like the multitude of Asian Americans and how diverse and complex we are is an example of pluralism. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, now that you've learned a little bit about pluralism, right, a group and having lots of different interests and identities within that group, why is it important for us right now to know about pluralism? Why do you think it's important for us to know about it? And what should we do now that we know what pluralism is? These are two hard questions. I'll give us about 2 minutes to be able to look over these. Let's put it in the chat. I really appreciated the answers. Let's keep that up here. So I'll give us two minutes to answer these questions in the chat. That was about 2 minutes, and it looks like I did start out with, learning about pluralism reminds me that even whenever I am advocating for something, I always know that there are other people I might be missing out on. An example of that is I used to work on language justice work, so making sure that things were being translated and interpreted in languages other than English. And I shouldn't only fight for Mandarin, right? Because that's not the whole Asian American community. Thinking about pluralism, I had to remember that I had to think about Mandarin, but I also had to think about Cantonese and Toisanese here in Chicago, but also remember that Urdu and Hindi are also extremely popular languages, right? And so remembering that the Asian American community is very different in between, right? That pluralism. Leslie had started out with saying overall, it's a good practice of democracy, knowing that we're not all the same and we don't have to be, right? Otherwise, it'll always be the same group of people fighting for what's best for themselves, rather than realizing that we can fight for something that's good and it ends up being good for everyone, right? And ends up that that's not that radical of a notion. It is possible. It looks like Nicole very much agrees with Leslie here. One can fight for others and also benefit from someone else fighting for their shared interests. Happens all the time, 100%, right? Sometimes I think about remote work, right? Remote work can be really, really good for people who have different language abilities, because then they can use their tech as much, tech more to translate things. They might not feel as anxious socially, and it's really good for physically disabled people, right? So a fight can be for one group and still benefit other people as well. Leslie is very curious. Is very curious here. Pluralism is important, but it seems like people always find their own communities and live with their own kind. If that's human nature, why are we this way? Leslie, good question. I would actually challenge this, and I really appreciated the fact that you wrote this in the question. If it's human nature, why are we this way? We actually might not know if it's human nature, which I think is important for us to realize. How much do we give too much credit to human nature? So at least I can only say in America, in the history of America, people find their own communities and live amongst their own kind because the United States has made it very difficult to make that otherwise. We have shut out people from home loans, so then they can only be in certain communities where they can afford a home. Or maybe
I'm not
they're,
sure I understand.
oops. Or it could be our school rules, right? You have to live in the particular same zip code to go to a particular school. So then that means all of the people in the same neighborhood go to the same school and people can't intermix, right? There are lots of different rules and laws within the entire history of the United States that has purposely segregated people, right? I even think about the person who cuts my hair here in Chicago's Chinatown. He said that he has also like tried to get jobs outside of Chinatown. And every single time he's met with the same feedback, which is we can't hire you because your accent's too heavy. Right. And so like we build this in like laws and rules and culture to make people not be able to fit in. And I oftentimes think to myself, if I did not know English, I would see why Chinatown feels safe to me, because I quite literally cannot read English in the other 70 neighborhoods here in Chicago. And how is that the case for so many other people? I can only imagine, right? Leslie, I appreciate your curiosity, and I appreciate how willing and open you are in the answers that I have, for sure. To me, pluralism means not only to respect different people's culture, but also finding common ground. So, I think that it's always important, as what Michelle is sort of saying, right? Is like both things can be true. Understand people's uniqueness and embrace that for all it has, and find common ground. They happen at the same time, all of the time, right? And especially, as you say, for such a diverse country, that becomes very important. And it's also important, kind of like looping back to Leslie's point, that remember that if this feels hard to find common ground and find how we're unique, in a country that has always legalized segregation, it's always going to be very hard work. And so know that that's like not on you. It's not your fault. It's not because you're not trying hard enough, but it's because we live in a difficult country in which that makes it so. Nicole said when the minority gets something they deserve, then there is a safety net for everyone else, and the rest of society benefits when they're in similar situations. 100%. And I think, Nicole, what you're saying is also a reminder of how we think about privilege as well. We don't only want to like earn the privilege, but we want to almost like reset the system that gave us the privilege as a whole, so everyone can benefit in the long run, including yourself, right? Again, I really appreciate the dialogue that's happening in the chat. I really, really love how people are coming with like an open mind and trying these things on. So something that I want to remember for all of us, kind of like how Michelle was talking about, like embrace our unique, distinct cultures while also finding common ground. Same thing with privilege. You can experience privilege and you can also be discriminated against at the same time, because we all have multiple identities. And I am going to talk about that with intersectionality. And as I had mentioned in the last training, it really depends on the situation. Privilege is not always up here all of the time. Sometimes it wavers. And I also want us to remember, there's no one system, there's no single reason why oppression happens or why privilege happens. There's lots of different systems, lots of different frameworks and laws and whatnot that make the inequalities happen. We talked about our tax system, our healthcare system, our school system, our housing system, right? Our laws. As you can see here, even workplaces. There's so many different systems that help run the way that we live and the lives that we have, that there's, again, no one reason why inequality exists. There's lots of reasons happening at the same time as to why inequality exists. So now that we've been able to reflect a little bit about pluralism, I want to move over into intersectionality. And as you can see here, the term intersectionality was coined in 1989. I have a feeling some of us were born before 1989, which means that this is not a very old term. This is not a very old word, right? So this is a more recent term, and it was created by a law professor, and her name is Kimberly Crenshaw. She actually teaches at UCLA and Columbia University. She's like all over the place. It's amazing. And she specializes in a special type of law called critical legal race theory, which basically talks about how racism is like embedded within all the systems that we have in the United States, is really what it's like generally about. And then being a scholar of critical race theory in the legal sphere is like looking into those laws and understanding what were some of the motivations behind that racism and how racism does like really infect the way that the law comes out. So that being said, just because she invented the word does not mean that she invented the concept. People have been talking about intersectionality for thousands of years, actually. Many people who are Native, Indigenous, queer folks, many people who are minorities, sort of like talked around the term, but then she like really put a face to the name, so to say. And so very similar to what I had talked about in the last in this particular slide, there isn't any one system or any one reason as to why privilege and oppression exists. Same thing here. There is no real one distinct factor that makes us who we are. As you can see here on the bottom, according to intersectionality, inequities, they are never the result of single factors or single reasons. They are the outcome of the intersections of different social locations, power relations, identities, privileges, and experiences. Really, what was happening in the backstory here was that intersectionality was talked about because there was a lot of talk about white people. There was a lot of talk about Black people and how they were treated. And Kimberly Crenshaw really came up with this observation that when we talk about Black people, we are oftentimes talking about Black men. And when you're a double minority, a Black woman, when those when those identities intersect, right? This is where intersectionality comes in. We realize that we have very unique experiences because of it. Right. So, for example, when I think about intersectionality, I think oftentimes of like being an Asian American, being a woman, and being disabled, right? And so we're all made up of a lot of different identities. They all come together in certain situations, and that changes the way we experience the world and also changes the way that we experience inequality. So with that said, we're actually going to like try on intersectionality and we're going to like practice it. So as you can see, what we have here is if you look at the smaller green ring, those are your identities, right? So like, for example, I talked about my race, right? Being Asian American. I talked about my gender being like female or a woman. I did talk about having a disability, right? Which is another identity. That's in the small green ring. In the blue ring, it kind of boxes up sin because there are all these ways in which we discriminate people that really like sort of box us into only our identities and the inequalities that really shape who we are. And that discrimination is really pushed by our legal system and the economy and immigration and war and education. As you can see, that's on the outer ring, right? So as we can see, this blue ring and the green ring on the outside, they really shape the forces on the way that we think. But they don't necessarily define who we are, right? And so we always want to be sure that when we're thinking about like how prejudiced we might be or how we want to be a lot more accepting and open-minded, remember the things that stop you from being open-minded have to do with that big green outer ring and that blue ring. But with all that said, let's actually practice our intersectionality. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write some of my identities together. And the harder thing is I'm also going to write down a unique situation that has occurred to me because of the intersection of a lot of different identities. I will place it in the chat. I will voice it out loud, and then I will have you all type it into the chat, and I'll give you a few minutes to do that. So I'm going to model first, then I'll give you time to place it into the chat. So I'm going to think out loud as I type. So I talked about being an Asian American woman with disabilities. So I chose 3. You can choose 5. You can choose 2. It doesn't matter. There's just more than one, right? All these identities intersect. This is the smaller green ring. And then the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write down into the chat a situation that has happened to me because of my unique intersections. So, for example, in the workplace, I notice that people think Asian American women, not necessarily Asian American men. I notice that people think Asian American women are extremely submissive, quiet, never want to cause trouble. They also tend to think I'm smart in the workforce. However, when I tell people I have disabilities, they are really confused and are unsure whether or not I am intelligent. And that's how we see people with disabilities, right? So do you see how what I described is an intersection of a lot of different identities, and it puts me in a unique experience that an Asian American man may not necessarily feel, or someone without disabilities, they might not necessarily experience this either. Or someone who is white and disabled, they may not necessarily experience what I just typed in. You're going to place your identities, and if you can, place a situation that's very unique, that's the intersection of your identities. It is 7:34, and I am going to give you 3 minutes to type it into the chat because I know that it's going to take a little bit longer. Obviously, if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to type it into the chat. But otherwise, your 3 minutes to type starts now. Yeah, Leslie, do yourself. So just like how I modeled, I did myself. Thanks very much for that. Right, talking about marital status, talking about family status, immigration status, right, gender, race, like how like that creates unique experiences, right? Versus like an Asian American woman who's married versus an Asian American woman who has kids, right? Like we're put in particular situations and experience those situations differently because of the intersection. 100%. People tend to assume that a certain age, Asian American women will get married and prioritize family for sure, definitely, right? Like Asian Americans, how they're oftentimes perceived as like family people, right? Or how often Asian American women are perceived as like more attractive than other racial groups. And so people expect, like, oh, why aren't you married, right? Like there are definitely lots of unique situations and experiences because of the intersection of particular identities, for sure. I really appreciate you sharing that. Assuming that people with a work visa don't get political, don't get involved in DEI initiatives, for sure. And I would even argue women with work visas, they're not necessarily perceived as being political, or Asian Americans on work visas not necessarily assumed to be political either, or get involved in DEI initiatives. For sure, 100%, right? These are the ways in which we're thinking about intersectionality. Oh my God, that's really weird. I'm so sorry that that microaggression happens to you. Michelle said, like being super short is also part of it, right? Like body size and body type, right? People who are like a little bit larger, or some people use the term fat, right? In ways that like people feel like they experience the world differently, or someone who's extremely tall, right? And sort of like, looks like they can overpower something, right? They experience the world differently, for sure. And I think that there's definitely sort of like this intersection of how Asian Americans are deemed as like small and short, right? Very much so. And in what ways does that change the way that we experience life, for sure? 100%. Okay. Skin tone. Yeah. So skin tone, if we're talking about skin tone, we're definitely talking about the term colorism, right? As one of the many isms, right? In the blue ring, that would be a part of that, right? Like darker skin versus lighter skin, things like that. 100%. With that said, I appreciate you trying on and talking about yourself in this particular case. I do want to say I do have some resources, and we do have it is like you are allowed to access this deck. Michelle does have it, in case that you would like it, but I do have some extra resources for you. But otherwise, we do have 20 minutes, and I am going to stop my share. That's all I had for us today, and really want to